Hey everybody, Danielle Hargenrader here, and welcome to another episode of Unleash Your Diabetes Dominator. And actually, you know what? This is real life, like I just told Hannah. So I'm going to tell you her first name, and then she's going to tell you her last name, because Hannah is joining us today from Switzerland, and I, with a last name like Hargenrader, know what it's like to have your last name messed up by somebody. So Hannah, what is your last name?
Boethius.
Boethius. Okay, so Hanna Boethius is a coach. She's a writer and speaker, and she loves diabetes topics that are off the beaten track. She's passionate to find motivational and inspiring ways to bring about changes in diabetes management. Over the years, Hanna has coached numerous people, including herself. She has a profound understanding of how things like nutrition and lifestyle choices can balance diabetes. Hanna is an expert in pinpointing what each individual needs in order to thrive with and despite diabetes. She has over 30 years of firsthand experience with diabetes, as well as that of her many clients. So Hanna, thank you for joining us today from Switzerland. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I'm very glad. Love to reach out across the borders, and because I know America has 30 million people with diabetes, but there's 400 million around the world, and I want to connect with everyone everywhere. So I'm really glad to have you on. Yeah, that's going to take a lot of interviewing. So yeah, so why don't you tell us, like we always do here on this show, kind of tell us your story of diagnosis. So you were probably pretty young, based on the fact that you say you have 30 years, so you're probably just a young child. So give us whatever you remember about your diagnosis, and kind of from what happened then till where you are now.
All right. Yeah, so I was diagnosed when I was 2 years old. Basically, it came down to the fact that my mom didn't recognize her daughter anymore, because I was, the usual, tired, and then I drank a lot, and I peed a lot, all the usual signs. And she didn't recognize me, so she took me to the doctors, and of course they diagnosed me with type 1 diabetes. And as this was 1980 something, the equipment that was available at that time was not exactly fun, and my mom was petrified of needles as well, so she had to chase around me, her 2-year-old daughter, with these huge needles a couple of times a day to just to keep me alive. And that, I think, was a little bit really difficult for her and for me too, but I didn't really quite understand anything about it, so it was more hard for her than for me, I think, at that point. What I remember from the diagnosis itself, I remember that they had a huge cupboard at the hospital with like all the nightgowns, and I got to choose whichever one I got. And I remember I had a favorite doll in the playroom, so to speak, that I wasn't allowed to take home afterwards, and I was really sad about that. So yeah, that's sort of my diagnosis story. I don't remember much, but that maybe can be explained by my young age.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your life growing up with diabetes? And I'm assuming that you've lived in Switzerland this whole time.
Nope.
No? Okay, well, tell us about kind of the transition between 2 years old and however old you are now, and kind of your diabetes journey along the way.
Cool. Yeah, so I was born in Sweden, and when I was under 1 year old, we moved to Finland, where I lived for 15 years, where I then, did all the school stuff, and with diabetes, and the teenage stuff, and all that stuff that isn't very easy. I was the only kid for a very long time at my school who had diabetes, so I was quite picked on sometimes, and people thought I was weird, and that of course is really painful when you just trying to melt in and be like everyone else, and go to school like everyone else. And then the teenage years kicked in. To make a very long story very short, the teenage years kicked in, and that was brutal. It was terror. My blood sugars, went from quite stable to, everywhere on the plane they were, up and down and up and down. And the quite unfortunately usual, this up and down sort of mountain pattern of blood sugar readings. And that, of course, wasn't very motivating for me as a teenager, when you're anyways trying to, just not be so different, just trying to melt in, sure, what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
And so actually during my teenage years, at times I even just completely stopped caring. it was just too hard to handle. It was too much. It was too hard. I didn't get the support and the sort of help that I needed at that point. Everything my endocrinologists and stuff did, they would just shout at me and that I was doing a bad job and super unmotivating. And I'm sure if the roles would have been reversed, they would not have appreciated that treatment either, really.
I think that unfortunately we still have a lot of that going on. I don't know, how it is over there, but we have a lot of that going on. I'm, lucky enough to go to a lot of conferences here in the United States, and one of the biggest patient complaints is the relationships that we have with our endocrinologists, and how it's, a lot of people are always kind of not wanting to go because they're afraid of getting scolded, you didn't do this, or you're non-compliant.
Yeah, that is a terrible word.
It's a horrible word.
Terrible.
Like you said, if they actually understood what living with diabetes was like, that would not be the case, and they probably would be a lot more sensitive to the reality of the emotional and mental side of having a chronic disease that requires so much input on our own. So basically living and making the decisions of an organ of your body basically on your own, and I think that's why I'm very prone to look for healthcare providers, or I do a lot of my own healthcare, but when I need things done by an endocrinologist, I'm much more prone to look for an endocrinologist that actually has diabetes themselves. Yeah. And there are quite a few, but yeah, so I'm assuming, since you just said so, that was happening to you as well as a teenager, getting scolded and that. So what was kind of, a point, so obviously you're in a place now where you're feeling very great about your diabetes and you're feeling confident and you're helping other people with theirs. So did you have like a one moment, or was it a gradual progression towards, whatever, finding your passion or your kind of rhythm with controlling not necessarily controlling your diabetes, but figuring out the right choices to make so that you could have better management?
Yeah, but that came a lot later than being a teenager. So basically, in the middle of my teenage years, my family, or I moved along with my family to Switzerland, where I live again now. And in between there, I lived in London and in Stockholm and in Berlin and a few other places. And so basically this scolding thing and this unsupportive so-called help just continued. Didn't matter where I was, in which country. And I was, after a while you get tired of trying to pick yourself up the whole time. Self-motivation in diabetes is super important. And, I know that better than anyone at this point. But when you just don't get any support at all from anywhere else, it becomes so heavy. It's crazy. And so it took me another 10 years of trial and error. At least I, had started caring again, but not, found my way. So it took me another 10 years of, trial and error and, trying one thing and it landed me in hospital, and I tried another thing and it landed me in hospital. I kept getting beat down when all I was doing was trying and trying to do everything by the book, which, already then I should have realized that that's not the way to go for me. But my really aha moment came when I re-educated myself as a nutrition coach. And, we went through all these things in the body, and then how the body reacts with carbohydrates and the role of insulin, all of this stuff is super exciting and interesting for me. And my teacher points me out and he's like, Hanna, you don't even make this hormone. Maybe you should think twice what you're eating. I'm like, thanks, was my first, initial reaction. And then I'm like, oh, you're so right. And actually, in hindsight, he did save my life at that very point. And so after that, I started really, really, really paying close attention, recording everything. And the best thing I did after that was to start cutting out the carbs. So I started cutting out gluten because I have celiac disease in the family, and although I'm not diagnosed, there's still sensitivities and all that stuff. So I started cutting out gluten, so all the breads, all the pastas, everything baked, basically. And then I started cutting out the rice and the potatoes, just very, very gradually to see how much better I was doing without this stuff. Because for me, it's not, I can't handle it. I can't get the dosage of insulin to work with the amount of carbs.
Right. So a lot of people who are watching might wonder, and I get asked this a lot too. So as that gradual progression kept happening, now where you are now, how many grams of carbs do you eat in a day? And I get asked this all the time. And I eat, probably anywhere between 80, 90, 100. Like, for a lot of people that are on a low carb diet, they don't consider that low carb. But for other people that eat the standard American diet, which is pretty terrible, that's actually really low. So what about, where are you on the kind of carb spectrum, where it makes you feel good, where Hanna feels good in that range?
Where I feel good is about 30 grams a day.
Okay. So we're talking very low carb.
We're talking very low carb because although I'm very active, I'm not an athlete, for example. So I don't have that burn, so to speak, of the carbs. I feel a lot better when I substitute some, or even the major point of part of the carbs with fat, for example.
Sure. And I agree. There are a lot of people that have that. They do high carb, low carb, high fat, and they do a variety of different things. Like, where I've tried to be, because I'm a big experimenter, I think of myself as a walking science experiment, and I'm excited to be able to actually have the opportunity to try different things out, manage it and measure it and see how it works. And I've gone very low carb, and I found that I've just been so sluggish. But I think that is because I do very heavy, intense weightlifting 3 to 4 times a week. And then I do cardio and I do yoga on top of that in different days. So I think without that heavy, intense exercise, that low, but I also know, athletes that are way more athletic than me that thrive on low carb, high fat. So I think it really just, I'm a big believer in, we all have to find what works best for ourselves. But I think that the attitude around that is, and I doubt that it's just American mindset, is that we want to see what's going to happen right now. And people are kind of unwilling to stick to one way of eating for long enough to find out how it's actually going to affect their system, which in my mind is at minimum a whole month, because your body has to take that time to adjust to what's actually happening. And so people just kind of give up too quickly. So I don't know if that's been your experience as well, but
no, absolutely. And because diabetes is such an individual disease, like, it's so different for every single patient is completely different, or every client I work with is completely different. And we have to, mix and match and do this little puzzle work in the beginning just to find what works out for them. Just because I'm eating this super low carb and I thrive on that doesn't mean that, the next person will, or for example, you will. Right. It just means that I will, and that's a solution that works for some people.
Absolutely.
And what I always think it's so interesting is this whole misconception, or I don't know if you can call it that, but misconceptions about ketones when you're that low carb, and that, that would lead to automatic diabetic ketoacidosis, which it clearly doesn't, but not a lot of people know that.
Yeah, and the thing is ketones are naturally occurring. Ketones are in your urine, whether you're low or high. So I think I understand where you're coming from, is from an athletic background. I've had people talk to me about ketones. I said, your blood sugar can be 80 and you'll have ketones. It's not necessarily something that, you have to worry about DKA, but on the other end of the spectrum, if your blood sugar is 500, 400, and then you have, it really is a matter of taking all of the picture into consideration versus
exactly
little pieces, like you said. So
yeah, exactly. And that's what I find so interesting as well, because most people that I talk to about, very low carb, and that is an option for even type 1 diabetics, not just type 2, which, it's really beneficial for them because they don't use as much of or they don't have to produce as much of the insulin that as they are at the moment if they just cut down the carbs. It becomes this like stigma and this like really infected point almost, that, oh my God, you are doing super low carb and you're going to die soon. And I'm like 5 years in, still here.
Yeah, I always say the same Like if you tell someone that you eat only healthy foods and you eat organic and you eat this and that, or even if you tell them you're mostly vegetarian, which I mean, I don't label myself as a diet, but I don't eat a lot of meat just because I feel better when I don't. They're like, oh, well, where are you going to get your protein and how are you getting your nutrients? But then you tell somebody that you're going to go eat at McDonald's and they're like, cool. And you're like, what? I don't understand where the mentality behind that comes into play, but it's true. I mean, people are it's not in general, it's lack of education, not necessarily only lack of education, but the education that people are getting, well, at least from our side, from like the US government type stuff, like FDA, it is just horrifying to think that that's what we're telling people. You know, most foods that are being recommended aren't actually food. It's actually just processed chemicals that are in a package, and it's scary. So, you know, like you said, you got re-educated. I did my own. That's how I became, you know, I went to college to become a nutritionist, but funny enough, half of the stuff that I learned in my college classes, I would never teach to a client today, ever. Like I would never, but I have a degree, but I also have lots of my own, you know, research that I've done on my own and that I've worked with clients and done on my own. And I just read tons of books and I do lots of alternative kind of, into alternative, like you said, off the beaten path, you know, ways of treating things, because I think the path that's been beaten is a scary path to be on. So it's not one that I like to travel.
It definitely is. And then just, you know, this whole, oh, eat whatever you want and just cover for it with insulin. I'm like, if it would be that simple, I would be so happy. Like seriously, I'd be so happy. And I would be on the streets, like preaching it, like whatever, but it doesn't work for everyone. And for the few that it does work for, I'm really happy for them. And it's great, but it doesn't work for so many of us. Yeah. And that's why I think it's time, you know, to find other solutions. And exactly what you're talking about, these like alternative things and thoughts and theories about, especially diabetes management, because it's such a huge issue now. I think that's so important.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what you just said really kind of rang true for me, because I had a parent bring a 14-year-old type 1 to me, and she had only been diagnosed maybe a year and a half before that. And she was going to one of the most prestigious hospitals in the city that I'm from. I'm not going to give it a name because it's actually an amazing hospital that does really great work for children. But the thing and so her A1C was 10 when she came to me, and they, you know, were saying, well, we're doing everything that they're saying and this and that. And then I asked them to keep a food log for a few days, and I saw that she was eating, you know, Swedish fish and pasta and all kinds of stuff. Like that was like her regular diet. And then they came back again for the next session. And I said, well, you know, you said you're doing everything that the doctor said, you know, I have to ask, was that the diet that the doctors recommended that she follow? And they said, well, the doctors just said, and this is what reminded me of it, as long as she covers for it with insulin, enough insulin for the carbs, that she can eat whatever she wants. And here's the reality of it. Anybody can eat whatever they want. Like if nobody's force feeding anybody anything. No. We all have the option. But the thing is with insulin, it's going to have a reaction days and days after. So people don't realize that, you know, you eat Swedish fish and pasta today, 2 and 3 and 4 days later, that glucose is binding to your red blood cells, and it takes a long time for it to detach itself. So your blood sugars are going to be, so you can bolus or get enough insulin for something that you're eating right now, but days and days later, you're going to have to increase your insulin continually and the more insulin we take, the more ability our bodies have to retain fat. And it's just this cycle. So I totally agree. You know, we can eat whatever we want, but is that a safe and healthy practice for people living with diabetes that are insulin dependent? I personally do not think so. I know from my own experience that it's a detrimental path, and it's scary that doctors at some of the most prestigious hospitals in our country are giving out that advice to newly diagnosed children and their parents. So
I sort of face palm every time I see that sort of a story. And I just think, poor, seriously, if you would just know, you know, that there is another way, and, you know, you don't have to have this roller coaster CGM curve. It's fine. You can have, like, you know, not perfect by any means. There's no such thing as a perfect diabetic. That's not possible. But, you know, at least not have that exhaustion that comes with those jumps, and not have that sort of feeling of failure because, you know, like, oh shit, it's not supposed to be that high, and all of this stuff. And then, you know, you bolus and you bolus again and you bolus again, and then all of a sudden you're in the low 50s and you're like, oh good, what did I do? And then you feel bad for that. And, you know, it's not only about the numbers, it's also about the emotions that go with the numbers. Unfortunately, although we shouldn't think of it that way, you can't help it.
Yeah, it can definitely turn into a vicious cycle for sure. And I think we can talk about this at length, but I think a lot of people, they ask me this as well. So I want to ask you, so as you kind of gradually changed your diet from eating, you know, whatever you were eating, and then you got lower and lower carb, what did you replace? You know, you said you took out rice and potatoes and bread and so forth. And so what did you put in its place? Like, you know, how did your diet change? Because I'm a big fan of not depriving people of things, but giving them things to replace the things that they were eating that were not so healthy, so that they still felt like they were having what they wanted to have, but it's just a different option for it. And most of the times I find people enjoy the new option even more than the old one, because they didn't know that it was there, or how to kind of make that work. So, you know, give us some examples, if you would, about your, you know, what did you change? What did you put in after you took stuff out?
Well, on a just in one word, I took out carbs and replaced it with vegetables. So basically, it's not zero carb by any means. I still get carbs from vegetables, just not in those sort of masses that are so-called prescribed for us by the normal sort of ADA or equivalent people. So basically, in the beginning, it's really important because people are missing their pasta, and they're missing this and they're missing this. It's really important to find substitutes for those exact things. So, for example, for rice, you can put cauliflower through a food processor, boil it a couple of minutes, and then you have rice that it fills the same function. It doesn't taste anything, gives you a bit of chewiness, and then that's it. You know, it's the same thing. It's just not the carbs. Or zucchini pasta, for example. You slice up zucchinis and, you know, just fry them a little bit, and then there you go. Or also in the beginning, it's really important, this thing with bread. You know, I don't know how it is. I haven't been in the States enough to know your bread culture, but here it's, you know, a huge thing, you know, and people cannot live without their bread, preferably with Nutella on it in this part of the world. But
yeah, it's like that here too. We have a very strong affinity for bread in America as well.
Yeah. So, for example, then you're back to, you have to make most of the food. There's no, or at least not much, like low carb convenience food. So then you have to become interested in your own health, that you're willing to stand in the kitchen for a bit every day. And that is also a hurdle for people to get started with this whole thing and get started with a healthier life, because they're just not willing. There's no interest. And I understand that. I'm not particularly interested in cooking food, but I know that if I don't, I'm going to feel worse. And that is my motivator to actually stand there and do the stuff that I, you know, rice a cauliflower, or you know, chop up some zucchini or whatever it is. Or then for bread, making the bread myself with, you know, things like almond flour and stuff like that. In the beginning, that's absolutely fine. After a while, you know, that for me at least, and for many of my clients, that sort of subsides. Yes. And it just sort of disappears, you know, like bread, meh, okay, fine, but I don't need it.
Yeah, no, I find that that's the same thing that I've experienced as well. And I don't know if you guys have it over there, but we have this thing called Ezekiel Bread, which is made from whole sprouted grains. It's not what I would call low carb, but, you know, one slice of bread has about 11 grams of carbs, where there's no flour in it. There's no ground up flour at all. So, I mean, that's a good alternative for people that are used to just plain old processed flour bread, kind of transition out. And I know I'm lucky just because I've always loved to cook, but I've also found, again, through my experience with working with people, specifically people that don't enjoy cooking, is that when you do end up getting into that rhythm of making your own food, it's empowering. You feel a sense of power and control and confidence, because you know what? I'm choosing what goes in my body versus being at the kind of whim of big food manufacturers, and they get to choose what's in my food, and half the time you don't even know what it is because some of the words on the ingredient label aren't even things that you understand because they're chemicals. And so, yeah, it not only does the bread thing subside, but I also find that people start beginning to feel that cooking is a privilege versus a chore after they do it for a certain amount of time and they see the results that come along with it. And I think that that's something that, you know, goes with the mindset shift of feeling like your health is a burden versus feeling like it's a blessing that we actually get the opportunity to make these choices. Whereas in a lot of places around the world, Africa, you know, of underdeveloped countries where they don't even have insulin, let alone the ability to get in the kitchen and make their own food. So there's a lot of mindset shifting that happens around that nutritional, the feelings we have around our nutritional health.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's not only about the nutrition where that mindset A happens or B needs to happen. It's also, you know, the whole view, basically not to scare anyone off, but basically your whole like view of the world has to change, because you have to take so many more things into consideration than you did when you just, okay, I'll do this because my health is a burden. When you actually take that step and empower yourself and step into your big shoes, you know, and actually take responsibility for your health, you have so many other things than the food to think about, like exercise, you know that better than anyone. and things like, for me, that has been very, very good and has helped me a lot in dealing with diabetes is things like relaxation, de-stressing, meditation, for example, has helped me hugely. And just, you know, and then just, you know, getting, and through making these changes, of course, in baby steps, because don't change too much at once or you'll get super unmotivated for the rest of your life. But that also helps to then change your view of both yourself and the world and your diabetes and everything, and you start to see things in a more positive light when you start getting more positive results.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've described this before as how I feel about the way that I've progressed, again, over many years, like you said, because if we over inundate ourselves with a million things at once, that's called setting yourself up for failure, or actually self-sabotage, because the human brain can only handle so many things at one time. So we really want to keep it focused on one major thing at a time. But that's how I see it. It's like you say everything has to change, and it's true. It's like an upgrade. So like kind of like you'd upgrade your software, you'd upgrade, you know, anything to a new version. It's like that was version 1.0 and now I'm upgrading to version 2.0. And at this point in my life, I'm probably at like version like 33, because that's how old I am. I mean, like every year I upgrade to a new operating system because I learn more. I find out more stuff that works for me, and maybe my mind shifts or something shifts. And I'm going to be the first person to say that maybe there's something 5 years ago that I was like, you know what? Back then, I thought that was cool, but now I think it's stupid. And I'm totally fine with admitting that, because I'm always about learning and growing and figuring out what works and taking the things that do work and keeping them, and then taking the things that don't work and like just sweeping them to the side and saying, hey, I tried it, it doesn't work, and moving on. And I think that a lot of people are just so unwilling to, I think, admit that they're wrong. But I think that being human means that we're wrong. Like you can't be human and not be wrong. And I think that's one of the biggest hindrances to mindset shifts, is that we have to be like, hey, we were wrong, and now I'm going to do something new so that I can figure out what's right, and be okay with that, and just be at peace with it, instead of feeling like, oh, I'm a bad person, or, you know, I need to be perfect or whatever, because that's just, we're human, we're wrong, we have flaws, and that's just part of the game. And diabetes is the same way. So
definitely. Definitely. No, that's also really interesting, because things that you might have, you know, liked 5 years ago and thought was working for you, and it's not working anymore. It's also the other way around. Things that you thought 5 years ago that, oh my God, what is that? And then you're doing it now and you're like, oh, maybe no, it wasn't that bad at all.
That's how it was for me with yoga and meditation. Before
me too.
Like, oh, that's not for me, that's silly, you know, this and that. But now I swear by it. So you have to be just open to being, you know, pliable, plastic, just changing along with, you know, and just listening to your body and seeing how your body responds to it and how your mind responds to it, how it makes you feel. If it makes you feel good and you feel confident, then it works for you, regardless of what any critic or anybody out there is saying about it. You kind of just got to listen to yourself and go with what works for you. So awesome.
Absolutely. And also because diabetes is such a, it's a bit like living with a sort of toddler in you, because you know, it's stubborn, and it's mean sometimes, and it like pokes you right where it hurts, and at the same time it changes its mind, you know, 50 times a day sometimes. And sometimes you have, you know, these patches where it goes really well, and then you keep doing that stuff, and then one day just nothing works again, and then you have to reinvent the wheel again, and you're like, oh, come on, you know. But that's sort of the charm, though, with diabetes. I gotta say, if you gotta say one thing, at least it keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, it does. It makes you stronger, more conscious, more aware of everything in your life. And I actually, part of my book, I think diabetes, if we let it, allows us to appreciate what's most important in life, if we allow it to do so. So cool. So I think that, as I always say to most people that I talk to, we could talk about this forever, but I would like to get to what are Hanna's top 3 tips for thriving with diabetes. What has worked for you, and what is working for you now?
Oh, awesome. Okay, so first, really find what works out for you. Find your own diabetes way, because it's not the same for everyone, and barely for anyone it's the same. So you really have to find out what really works for you, what do you need to do for your diabetes and your life to feel awesome, and what can you do, and what can you change, what are the things that aren't feeling so great, what can you do about them. And you got to remember that that's probably not what you've been told so far. It's probably something completely different. So that's number 1, find your own way. Number 2, go out and live your life. As far as we're concerned, we only have one shot at this thing called life. So go out there, do the best you can, and be fantastically awesome. And also remember to celebrate the small stuff, because that's really important.
Yeah, that's my pinned tweet on Twitter. Celebrate everything. That's pinned at the top of my page. It's just, I'm so big on that. Don't let diabetes ever be the reason where you don't live out whatever makes you feel joyous and feel passion, and whatever your dreams are, just do it. Don't let diabetes be the reason that you don't, or anything. Just be happy. Like you said, we only have one go around at
this. As far as we know.
As far as we know. Maybe we have much more, but as so far, I can't remember any of my past lives, so we'll see.
No, me neither. So we're going for it. Yeah, and then as if you know, as anyone that has been working with me ever will tell you, it's she's all about the celebrating, I think, is the go phrase. Because that's something I really, really try to reinforce a lot, even with myself and with my clients as well. It's really important.
Absolutely.
Anyway, number 3, don't make life with diabetes harder than it has to be. Really find the easiest, most smooth way you can, because you don't have to make it more complex than you're willing to. Find there are certain things you have to do, like measuring and taking your insulin, and, you know, keeping check of what you're eating, more or less. But really don't take on more than you're willing to at any point of time, because that will overwhelm you, and in worst case, completely demotivate you forever about this. So really don't take on too much, and remember that there's always a way.
Yeah, I love it. No, that's great. Don't take on too much at once, but I think that, no, I love all your tips. I think they're great. I agree with all of them, and I'll just keep talking if somebody doesn't shut me up. So, so as usual, Hanna has given me her links, and they will be linked under the YouTube video and also under the video on my blog. So if you want to get in touch with her and ask her any questions, you'll be able to do that by just scrolling down. Hanna, is there anything else that you would like to add before we wrap it up?
No, I think we covered a lot. And I think we should just leave it at that, so we don't overwhelm anyone at once.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join me, and keep doing what you're doing. It's awesome. We appreciate it. And for everyone else out there, I will catch you on the next episode of Unleash Your Inner Diabetes Dominator. Bye, guys.
Bye.